I would have to say several things led me to this particular project. There were several kind of currents that pushed me in this direction. But really the main kind of force that pushed me into this was that I work in the field of media and cultural studies, and this is an area that media and cultural studies does not go into. There's like a wall there that says "do not enter," and so I found that intriguing. But I also have to say that I have been impatient with the field of media and cultural studies for the last several years. And it's an impatience with the potential that the field has and how it's kind of stuck in a rut. I mean, you make no mistake about it, media and cultural studies has really done some profoundly important work. And it's responsible for a lot of cultural insights that we're much better off for. And cultural studies in particular starts off trying to ask a very simple question that has very complex answers. And that question is, why do we consent to live in societies that are fundamentally unequal and have done so for centuries? And the answers that cultural studies came up with were very important, and the implications of their answers were also very important. So cultural studies, for example, is the field of thought that really put the concept that race is a social construct, that gender is a social construct. Cultural studies is really responsible for, those important insights. And those insights are so radical, really, that we're still struggling with them today. I mean, look at what's going on in Texas, right? Like, legislating which bathrooms boys and girls can go into, because we're still wrestling with this concept that race and gender are not real, much as biology might lead us to think they're real. Our concepts of them, what they mean, why we create these categories to begin with, those are social constructs. So what cultural studies did, the work that cultural studies did, is very important. But when that work started becoming common, it got stuck in a rut. So somewhere around 1981, Frederick Jameson, one of the really big ones in the field of cultural studies, wrote that, okay, it's time for us to move past analytic critique. And nobody did. So 9 years later, Megan Morris basically writes, the same thing. Cultural studies has gotten banal. It's just the same thing over and over again. We need to change. So I've been waiting for that change, and it hasn't come. And mostly what Jameson and Megan Morris were saying is it's time to get past analytical critique, that in some ways what we do as scholars is just reactionary. We wait for culture to happen, we analyze it, and then we say, well, see, this is why culture is the way it is. So when Jameson says in 1981, it's time to move past analytic critique, which is a negative hermeneutic, to use his terms, and move on to a positive hermeneutic, I interpret that to mean we need to take our analysis and what we do and start solving actual problems, start theorizing solutions to problems, not just talking about the roots of the problems. So that's what led me to this particular work. I saw a problem, and the problem is that when you look at some of the studies that the Pew Foundation puts out about, the erosion of religious life in America, that numbers are declining, amount of people that go to church, you see that Christianity is sort of losing ground to secular humanism. So why is that? And if you talk to theologians, their answer is Christianity is losing ground because at some point, the core messages of Christianity were more or less corrupted because Christianity, rather than being this sort of fringe sect, became the state. So it becomes the official religion of Rome, and that corrupts the message, so to speak. And then from Rome, it basically comes to power in the Middle Ages. It shares power with government in ways that overlap. And so theologians, or at least a good group of theologians, will say, well, the problem is, the sort of core message of Christianity isn't getting out there. So for me, that's a communications problem. So I came at it from the field of communications and said, okay, so if what we have is a communications problem, why is it that the institutional church can't get its message of egalitarianism out there? Why can't it get its message of non-materialism out there? When I look at that problem, I see that the church fundamentally doesn't know how to communicate. And it doesn't know how to communicate because it's never gotten too far away from what I would call its aesthetic. The institutional church and how it communicates is still stuck in the Middle Ages. And the only way it knows how to communicate, for the most part, is through hierarchy, through a position of power, sort of top-down communication, and it's not working. So what I did was try and come up with a transdisciplinary approach that would combine media and cultural studies with theology and look at this from an aesthetic point of view, to look at the problem and say, okay, if the church really doesn't know how to communicate, then how does it learn how to communicate its core message more effectively? The answer that I came up with, not incredibly surprising for being a media studies scholar, is, well, you can look to Hollywood because Hollywood knows how to communicate. Hollywood knows how to cultivate audiences, and it knows how to communicate really well and almost effortlessly, to the point where one week Hollywood can get you aligned with one position, and the next week it can have you aligned in the opposite position. Quick example, to use children's animation for an example. One week we're watching Finding Nemo, and we're rooting for the fish, right? And the people that capture fish, the people that eat the fish, it's like, oh, those are the bad guys. One week later, we're watching Madagascar, and we're following a different set of characters, and the conflict that comes up in that one is between the carnivores and the herbivores. And how is that conflict ultimately resolved? Everybody will eat fish. And there seems to be no problem there. So Hollywood is very good at constructing an aesthetic that knows how to align audience sympathies with the message that they want them aligned with. So I'm basically proposing that if we look at some of the aesthetic principles that Hollywood uses, some of these could be more or less appropriated by the institutional church to communicate more effectively. There is certainly a risk that if the church were to just wholesale adopt a Hollywood aesthetic, certainly the message, if not the church, would get corrupted. So essentially, I'm talking about two very distinct approaches. And one of them is to look at the sort of aesthetic principles that Hollywood uses more than the technique itself. And by aesthetic principles, I mean things like proximity. When Hollywood speaks to us through films, through television shows. The speaking relationship between the speaker and the audience is really an intimate one. That intimacy is manufactured through all kinds of techniques, through all kinds of aesthetic styles that it uses. But nonetheless, the principle there, speak intimately, is very viable for Hollywood. The church is not quite as adept at doing that. Again, it has a tendency to speak from the top down, and that, the followers should just listen to what is said because it comes from an authority. That's showing itself to no longer be effective. So one of the things I'm saying is that we look closely at the principles and not necessarily, just appropriate techniques blindly. But the other thing that I'm really looking at here in this project is a contradiction that I soon came upon. And the contradiction is really this, that of all the things that Hollywood does well, and Hollywood can speak on almost any subject really well, the one subject it can't speak on very well is religion. Hollywood has a lot of problems representing the Bible or doing biblical narratives. And it almost doesn't matter if it's the Old Testament or the New Testament. It does not do the Bible well. In fact, it does it pretty badly most of the time. The exception that I talk about in my book is with comedy. It has a little higher success rate with comedy, but straight narrative, dramatic narrative, Hollywood does not do religion very well. On the other hand, what I found in my research is that Hollywood does represent some core theological aspects of Christianity very compellingly when it doesn't know that it's doing it. So when we look in the margins of Hollywood films, not just the surface level story, but the sort of meta discourses that are coming along for the ride, that are one level below the narrative, then what you find are very compelling representations of core theological principles of Christianity. And they get told in ways that are far more exciting, far more compelling, that move audiences far more than the church does. So what I'm theorizing is, in a very unorganized, non-centralized way, in the margins of popular culture, what you can see is a new aesthetic, a new concept for Christianity forming out there in those margins, and that's what we need to explore. That's what we need to analyze more deeply if we want to come up with a new concept of church. And I think we can see that we have a pope who is very much asking the church to move in that direction, who's asking the church, the hierarchy, the people, to reconceptualize their notion of church, what church means. And he's also very adept at using messages and events to do just that. I mean, look at what he did in his first year of being Pope during Holy Week, the traditional washing of the feet. Rather than just doing it in the Vatican with 12 priests that are hanging around the Vatican, this guy went out, and he went out to a jail, and he washed the feet of the marginalized, including non-Christians. He was trying to send a very powerful message, and that message was, we can't keep thinking of church as obedience and authority. I want people to think of the church first and foremost as a place of mercy. So he's trying to get people to reconceptualize the concept of church. And in my book, what I'm doing is saying some of those concepts are forming out in the margins of popular culture without even realizing they're talking about a new concept of church. And it's probably our job to analyze that and bring it into focus. So it's looking in the margins more than it is just blindly adopting what Hollywood is doing. And in fact, what I'm looking at are ways in which certain films and television shows actually challenge the Hollywood norm, but in a way that challenge doesn't alienate their audience. The church doesn't need any more lessons on how to alienate audiences. Actually, when it came to choosing the films and the television shows and the books that I chose to include, the harder thing was keeping some out because I found a lot of source material to work with. But I think the common thread that I used in making my determination is which of these television shows or films or books challenged the mainstream modes of representation while trying to deliver these kind of compelling messages about core aspects of Christianity. So I started off with Mary Poppins. I included The West Wing. I wrote extensively about all of the Harry Potter books and the films. Squeezing that into one chapter was not fun. And then maybe some lesser-known films like Joyeux Noël and Life is Beautiful. The former was a French film, the latter an Italian film. All of whom brought up important theological issues, and more importantly, or just as importantly, really, how they represent, how they discuss those issues. So Mary Poppins was important because I used it as a kind of textbook example about how these discourses exist on the margins. I mean, you look at Mary Poppins, and it really is one of Disney's more popular films through the ages. I mean, it's a classic. And you look at that film, and the complexity of that narrative is daunting, really, when one takes a close look at it. I mean, it combines several genres into one film, right? So it's a children's film, it's a comedy, it's a musical, it uses live action and animation. It's packing all of these things into one narrative. And the way in which it does it seems pretty coherent, but at times even the audience recognizes, wow, they are just having a lot of fun with a lot of different genres. This is just play time for everybody. And it is. I think that's what makes it such a great film for children and the adults that watch it with the children. But what that allows the film to do, because it has so many different representational styles, is it allows these discourses to shape the narrative in ways that audiences don't quite perceive the active role that they're playing. So, for example, when I wrote about Mary Poppins, I write that what you can find working in this film are very specific Christian discourses organized around a Franciscan worldview, Saint Therese of Lisieux, and Miriam of Nazareth, or Mary, the Mother of God. The discourses of these three very important figures of Christianity work in this narrative. They shape the narrative trajectory. They give meaning to the events that unfold in this narrative. To the degree that, if you've ever seen the Disney film Saving Mr. Banks, almost everybody picks up on the fact that at a certain point, this stops being a children's film. At a certain point, this stops being a story about Jane and Michael and becomes a story about their father and about their father's redemption. Well, when you look at this story closely, that father's redemption, what shapes that redemption, is a very Franciscan worldview. It's a very Franciscan discourse about tending to the least of these, about how non-materialism is more important than materialism, than wealth, than gain. So the children bring that worldview unwillingly into the narrative, into this story world of banks and finance and high finance and global trade, and make it all collapse. And it's only at that collapse that the father can come to see what his real priorities in life are, not his work, but his children. Well, those events are shaped by a very active and a very dramatic Franciscan discourse that the film builds throughout the trajectory. So it's very easy to sort of see a playful comedy. It's very easy to see, the music and the dancing as all very fun and games. And it's really even easy to see that, oh, this becomes a very nice family story about reprioritization. What's not so easy to see, but it's there when we look closely, is this kind of Franciscan discourse and these other discourses of Christianity actively working to shape the message of this film. And I would argue in ways that the filmmakers did not consciously even intend to, but working through nonetheless. So I chose films that were like that where you see sort of challenges to the main way in which Hollywood speaks. And in those challenges comes these core messages of Christian theology. There are a lot of books on religion and media. I think what makes this project unique is that first, a media studies scholar went at this equation and not a theologian. You find most of the books on religion and media are written by theologians. They seem to have a much more active interest in what we do than media and cultural studies people have in what they do. So I felt that what makes this project unique is coming at it from, the other side, but also coming at it for a specific purpose. I mean, when I find theologians writing about religion and media, to a large extent, I find what they're doing is trying to find hidden religious meanings in texts. And that's all very fine and good, but for what purpose? I think what I brought to this project was a specific purpose, to try and get at a specific problem. And that problem is, why can't the church speak more effectively? And that if we looked at media, we might find answers to that particular problem. So I think that's what really makes this project kind of stand apart from a lot of the religion and media books that are out there. The research process is daunting and rigorous and really just a lot of hard work watching movies all the time. Just ask my children how difficult and daunting my research is. They can't make a noise in the house because I'm watching film. They are doing their chores and I'm watching film, asking them to make more popcorn because I'm watching film. So it's really quite a lot of hard work. It's a lot of drudgery, but I really had the discipline to, stick to it and watch yet another film or TV show. I mean, somebody out there has to do the dirty work. And I felt like, well, I'm just one of those people to go and do it. Well, in all seriousness, it is a process of trying to be constantly engaged with the discourses that Hollywood and alternatives to Hollywood are trying to disseminate in culture. I mean, this was really the beginning of cultural studies, was this understanding between scholars that the media does play an active role in shaping our society. And when cultural studies and media studies, really first started to try and get out there and make a difference, it was really against a concept, the sort of reigning concept in communications, that no, there's very little effects that the mass media has on the public. And cultural studies scholars really knew better. And so their job was to get at bringing analytical tools to the process that will show that no, the media really shapes culture. The media really has an active role. It doesn't reflect our society. It plays an active role in shaping our society. And so it brings some really sophisticated tools to bear on that process. So my job here really was to combine those analytical tools from media and cultural studies with theology. So it meant, reading a lot of theology, classical and contemporary. It meant writing to a lot of colleagues in theology saying, can you explain this to me a little more, so that I could bring more focus and more detailed analysis to the things that I'm looking at. Because frequently things would start off with me watching something casually with my family, with my friends, with other people, and saying, whoa, there's something more there. Let me look at it more closely, and subject it to analysis and say, wow, something theological really is going on there, which makes you have to cross over this, sort of concept of authorial intent, all the time. It's like, well, but did they intend that? And the answer is really no, I don't think so. And no, that is not nearly the determinative force that we think a message has. I mean, all of communications has sort of come to this point where we see how little someone's actual intent shapes a message. There are a variety of other forces that shape messages. So when it comes to media, which is really a collective message to begin with, several different people work to shape a message. The director is not the person who has the final shaping influence on a message. There are screenwriters, there are editors, there are camera people, there's all kinds of people working in various ways that shape a message. So intent isn't nearly as important as the sort of dominant discourses that are circulating in a society. And what are those dominant discourses? And how does the media appropriate them or challenge them? So the process that I have to bring to bear is analyzing that kind of compendium in each text and figuring out, well, for the purposes of this project, what speaks most loudly to shape an argument? But yes, it was a lot of viewing. That's why intentionality is such an important concept to deal with when we talk about film analysis and when we talk about media, and especially the way in which, a collective makes the message, a collective shapes the message. So how do we mediate this concept of intent? And it's really a process of analyzing how is it that certain social discourses keep insisting themselves in the work that people do, in the messages that people want to put out there, even when they put them out there unconsciously. Certain social discourses just don't go away. They just keep presenting themselves. They just keep having value. And to me, this is the measure exactly of how ineffective the church can be when it comes to communication. Because these discourses of Christianity are out there. These discourses of Christianity, egalitarianism, redemption, non-materialism, these are important to people. They do see them as having a very significant influence on people's lives. They see them as having great potential to transform society. So if these discourses keep insisting themselves, how is it that they're sort of doing that more despite the church, not because of the church? So that's why we want to be able to analyze what these messages are on the margins, and what's the church's relationship to these messages, and how can we get the church more attuned to communicating these messages more effectively and in more compelling ways. And that is kind of the inspiration for this project to begin with.